Imagine you're standing on a stone wall. The sun is beating down on you so hard it feels like a physical weight. You look out at the horizon and you get the news that should end your life. There are 20,000 professional soldiers coming to kill you. You look at your own side and you have maybe 1,200 guys. Most of them are sick, starving, or wounded. The math is simple. You are going to die. 17 enemies for every single one of you. Common sense says you lock the doors, hide, and pray. But then, one leader looks at that impossible math and says, no, we're not hiding. We're going to open the gates, march out into the open desert, and run straight at them. It sounds like absolute madness, doesn't it? But on a summer morning in 1099, that is exactly what happened. And what followed wasn't a massacre, was a miracle. Main story. Let's go back to July 5th, 10th, 1099. We are in Jerusalem. Now, you have to understand the mood here. The Crusaders had just taken the city 2 weeks ago. You might think they were celebrating, throwing parties, and relaxing. But they weren't. They were exhausted. They were a shadow of the great army that had left Europe years before. They had marched thousands of miles, died of disease, fought battles, and starved. The 60,000 people who started this journey, most were gone. What was left was a small, hardened group of survivors. And just as they are trying to wash the blood off the walls and find some water in the scorching heat, scouts come riding in, and they don't have good news. They report that the Fatimids are coming. Now, the Fatimids were the powerhouse of Egypt. Their leader, the vizier named Alafdel, wasn't just some local warlord. He was arguably the most powerful man in the region, and he was marching north with a massive army to take Jerusalem back. We are talking about 20,000 fresh troops. He had Mamluk heavy cavalry. These were slave soldiers trained from childhood to do one thing: kill from horseback. He had Sudanese infantry with giant spears. He had Ethiopian archers. He even had a baggage train of camels that was bigger than the entire Crusader army. Against this, the Crusaders had Duke Godfrey of Bouillon. He's about 39 years old, tough as nails, but he looks around his command tent and does the counting. He has maybe 1,200 knights and some infantry. That's it. This is the moment where logic goes out the window. If you look at military history, or if you look at videos explaining why the First Crusade succeeded, usually it's about sieges or big defensive battles. The smart move here was to stay inside Jerusalem. The walls were strong. Alafdel would have to lay siege. Maybe help would come from somewhere else. But Godfrey and his council knew something the history books sometimes gloss over. They knew that if they stayed in the city, they would starve. The Egyptians were masters of siege warfare. They would just surround the place, cut off the water, and wait. It would be a slow, painful death. So, the council meets. You have Godfrey. You have Raymond of Toulouse, who is the oldest and richest leader, but he's currently dying of a fever. He's shivering, barely conscious. Then you have Tancred, this young, fiery guy from Antioch who just wants to fight everyone. They argue. They shout. It's tense. But eventually, they agree on something that sounds suicidal. They decide to leave the safety of the walls. They decide to march out to meet this massive Egyptian army in the open field. Now, Imagine being a common soldier hearing this order. You've just survived the siege of Jerusalem. You're tired. Your armor feels like it weighs a ton in this heat. And now your lords are telling you to march 12 miles south to fight an army 20 times your size. You'd think they lost their minds. But they do it. On August 10th, they start gathering. It's important to note the state of these men. They aren't the shiny knights you see in movies. Their armor is rusted and dented. Their clothes are rags. Many have lost their horses and are fighting on foot. They are desperate men. Scouts bring back one crucial piece of information that changes everything. They locate the Egyptian camp. It's near a place called Ascalon on the coast. And here is the kicker. Alafdel, the Egyptian commander, isn't expecting them. Why would he? In his mind, the Franks, that's what they called the Crusaders, are cowering inside Jerusalem. He thinks he has weeks to prepare. He's taking his time, organizing his supplies, letting his men rest. He has absolutely no idea that the rats he thinks he has trapped are actually wolves coming for his throat. So, on the evening of August 11th, the Crusaders move out. I want you to picture this march. It's night. It's the middle of summer in the Middle East. Even at night, it's warm. Godfrey gives a strict order. Absolute silence. No talking, no trumpets, no drums. They wrap the horses' hooves so they don't clatter on the rocks. They are walking through the Judean hills in the dark. Every step is a risk. If one horse whinnies loudly, if one soldier drops his shield and makes a loud clang, an Egyptian patrol might hear them. If Alafdel finds out they are coming, he can just wake up his 20,000 men, form a line, and crush them. The element of surprise is the only weapon the Crusaders have. They march for hours. Thirst is a major problem. They don't have vast water supplies. Men are licking the sweat off their lips, but they keep moving. It's a march of ghosts. By the time the sky starts to turn that pale gray before dawn, they are close. They reach a valley near the coast. Below them, stretching out on the flat plain near the sea, is the Egyptian camp. It is huge. It's like a city of tents. Thousands of campfires are smoldering. You can smell the smoke and the cooking meat. The Egyptian soldiers are sleeping. Some are waking up, maybe stretching, making coffee or tea, getting ready for a lazy morning. They feel safe. They have pickets and guards, but they are looking for big army movements. Not a silent strike force that seemingly materialized out of thin air. Godfrey organizes his tiny army. He doesn't just charge in a mob. This is really interesting because often people think the truth about the Crusaders is that they were just savage brawlers with no brain. That's not true. Godfrey was a tactician. He splits his force into 3 groups. He takes the center. He puts Raymond of Toulouse, who is so sick he has to be helped onto his horse, on the left, near the sea. And he puts Tancred on the right. They form a line. Now, usually, medieval armies march in a column along line and then take hours to spread out into a battle line. Godfrey didn't do that. He marched them in a box formation that could instantly turn into a battle line. So, when they came over the hill, they didn't need to stop and organize. They were already ready to kill. It's about 5 a.m. The sun is just peeking over the hills behind them. This is another brilliant, accidental move. The sun is shining directly into the eyes of the Egyptians, blinding them, While the Crusaders are in the shadow, Godfrey raises his sword. No horns blow yet, just a silent signal. They start to jog, then they run, then the horses break into a gallop. Imagine you are an Egyptian sentry. You are rubbing sleep from your eyes, looking at the sunrise. Suddenly, out of the glare, you see hundreds of steel-clad monsters rushing at you. You try to scream, but before the sound leaves your throat, a lance takes you. The Crusaders hit the edge of the camp like a freight train. It wasn't a battle at first, it was chaos. The Crusaders crashed into the tents. Horses were trampling over tent ropes, bringing the canvas down on top of sleeping soldiers. Men were waking up in the dark, tangled in their blankets, only to be stabbed by a Frankish sword. The noise must have been deafening. Suddenly, the silence of the march was replaced by the screaming of men and horses, the clashing of steel, and the roar of fire as tents were set ablaze. Alafdal's army was massive, yes, but a sleeping army is useless. His cavalry, the deadly Mamluks, couldn't get to their horses. Their saddles were on racks. Their horses were tied up in the corral. A knight without a horse is just a guy standing there. A Mamluk without his horse is vulnerable. Tancred, on the right flank, tore through them. He didn't stop to loot. He drove his men deep into the enemy lines. He knew they had to break the spirit of the Egyptian army before they could wake up and realize they outnumbered the attackers. But let's look at the center. Godfrey is there, fighting like a man possessed. History tells us he was physically huge, a true warrior. Legend says at one point he cut a man in half with his sword. Whether that's true or not, the image matters. His men saw him fighting in the front, and it gave them strength. However, it wasn't all easy. Remember Raymond on the left? He's sick, he's old, and he's facing the Ethiopian infantry. These guys were tough. They managed to form a line. They dropped to one knee with their shields and long spears, creating a bristling wall of death. For a moment, the Crusader attacks stalled there. Knights charged in and got skewered. Horses went down screaming. It looked like the sheer numbers of the Egyptians might finally kick in. If the Egyptians could just hold the line for an hour, their superior numbers would surround the Crusaders. This is the turning point. This is where the battle that saved Jerusalem could have become the battle that lost it. But Godfrey sees the problem. He doesn't panic. He redirects some of his reserves and, yes, he kept a tiny reserve even with such a small army to hammer the flank of those spearmen. At the same time, the psychological shock was too much. The Egyptians looked around. They saw their camp on fire. They saw their commanders dying in their pajamas. They heard the terrifying war cries of these barbarians from the north. Panic is a contagious disease. Once it starts, it spreads faster than fire. Alafdel, the great vizier, tried to rally his men. He stood outside his massive command tent, screaming orders. But nobody was listening. He watched as his elite, heavy cavalry, the pride of Egypt, turned their horses around and fled. And once the cavalry runs, the infantry knows they are dead. The retreat turned into a rout. The Egyptians ran toward the city of Ascalon. But here is the tragic part for them. The gates of Ascalon were small. Thousands of men tried to squeeze through them at once. They crushed each other to death. Others ran into the sea, trying to swim to the Egyptian fleet that was anchored offshore. But knights in armor can't swim, and neither can panicked infantry. Thousands drowned. The battle, the actual fighting part, lasted less than an hour. In some accounts, the tactical issue was decided in 20 minutes. 20 minutes to destroy an army of 20,000. The Crusaders didn't just win, they wiped them out. Alafdel barely escaped with his life. He managed to get onto a ship and sail away, leaving his entire army, his reputation, and his treasury behind. And let's talk about that treasury. When the killing stopped, the Crusaders looked around the camp. They couldn't believe their eyes. Alafdel had brought everything with him. He had chests of gold diners, precious stones, silks, spices, and weapons made of the finest Damascus steel. He had brought his entire mobile court. The Crusaders, who had been starving and broke just that morning, were suddenly rich beyond their wildest dreams. Common foot soldiers were stuffing gold into their boots. Knights were claiming magnificent Arabian horses. They found the vizier's personal tent, which was filled with luxury goods. But beyond the gold, the strategic victory was absolute. If the Crusaders had lost this battle, the First Crusade would have been a failure. Jerusalem would have been recaptured, and the Christians would have been pushed into the sea. History would be completely different. Instead, this victory secured the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It proved to the local powers that these Franks were not just a passing raid. They were here to stay, and they were terrifyingly effective. It also changed the way war was fought in the region. The Muslims realized they couldn't just throw numbers at these guys. The Crusader heavy cavalry charge became the most feared weapon in the Middle East. It taught them that discipline and aggression could beat size. Now, as the sun began to set on August 12th, the scene was very different from the morning. The Crusaders walked back toward Jerusalem, but they weren't the scared, silent ghosts who had left. They were singing, they were leading camels loaded with gold, they were riding new horses. Godfrey of Bouillon, covered in dust and blood, had pulled off the impossible. He had rolled the dice on the survival of his entire people, and he had won. Sadly, Godfrey wouldn't live long to enjoy it. He died a year later. But that day at Ascalon, he cemented his legend. He showed that when your back is against the wall, and the math says you have no chance, the human spirit tend a really bold plunkan, rewrite the equation. So, the next time you hear about the Crusades, don't just think about the sieges. Remember the Battle of Ascalon. Remember the 1,200 men who looked at an army of 20,000 and said, "Let's go get them." It's a reminder that history isn't just about big numbers and big empires. Sometimes, it's about a handful of desperate people doing the absolute last thing their enemy expects. It's a story of pure, high-stakes gambling where the wager was life itself. And on that hot summer day, the gamble paid off in gold and blood. Outro. Thank you for listening to this story of impossible odds. If you enjoyed this journey into the past and want to hear more stories about the moments that changed history forever, please do me a huge favor, hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. I am the Sleeping Historian, and I'll see you in the next video.